1942 is a classic 1984 vertical scrolling shooter released by Capcom. It is loosely based around the World War II Battle of Midway. The aim of the game is to shoot down enemy planes and ultimately to reach Tokyo. It is the first game in the series which led to many sequels that have all been largely successful. The game itself was presented in a centralized vertical aspect ratio rather than full screen. It used Capcom Z80 arcade system hardware and was the first Capcom game designed with a Western audience in mind. This is why in the game we have an American Lockheed P-38 fighter plane, or more commonly known as the Super Ace. This is where Capcom wanted to begin dominating the Western arcade market, and dominated it eventually did, with 1942 just being one of the first sensational Capcom arcade hits. So today we are taking a look at the worst of the best home conversions of 1942, and as always, if I missed a port, which is likely as 1942 has been on many collection packages over the years, I truly do apologise. Anyways, let's fire up the P-38. Elite Commodore 64 1986 release has a few issues with it. Firstly, although the music is great, just a little bit different, and likely some of the best music for 1942 in this list, the gameplay itself is fairly awkward. Sprites just move far too fast for their own good here. They also seem to be a little bit too big, and when you have several enemies attacking you, there isn't a great deal of maneuver room here. This is just one thing which is really annoying, which happens over and over again. I found enemies appearing at the bottom of the screen, and that was pretty much an instant death each time because of the speeds they're going at. I also found on several occasions that shooting at enemy planes were not doing them any damage, so hit collision detection isn't wonderful here either. Quite an unfortunate conversion for the Commodore 64 all in all. Although not one of the best shoot-'em-up games on the ZX Spectrum, this version has at least playability. It scrolls well, and hit collision detection is pretty good here too. Yes, it is fairly basic in colours, but I would rather be playing this than the previous version, the Commodore 64 version, where shooting down enemy planes did them no damage. There is no music here, but we do have the amazing ZX Spectrum bubbly sounds for sound effects, which if you're a Spectrum fan, you will know that amazing bubbly sound that I mean. But on the last note, does this feel much like the 1984 classic arcade game? Well, only if you let yourself think so back in the day, and remember, young minds were created back then with such basic games like this one. This Sharp X1 1987 conversion by AC Corporation certainly has the music of the real thing, undoubtedly, as well as the sound effects, but sadly, that is all I can say possibly about this conversion. It looks good, and the Super Ace is looking really nicely detailed too, but everything else here just fails really badly. It's way too sluggish to play from the get-go, and frame drops are so bad here that it kind of makes the game a little unplayable. But in its defense, the Sharp X1 is a 1982 computer, so to have a game looking this good on a 1982 computer is pretty amazing, really. Next up, we have another Japanese home computer port with the Fujitsu FM7. Now, this one is kind of a mixture of the Sharp X1 and the next version port in this video. One noticeable thing here is that the screen can get so overwhelmed with enemy planes that it becomes very challenging at times to keep up. It does drop in frame rates, but nowhere near as badly as the X1's port. It's undeniable, it looks good for a game running on a 1982 computer, but really, if the coder calms down the number of sprites being on screen at once, this one could have been a really awesome home conversion when it released back in 1987. I will also note here that just like the other Japanese home conversions, the sound quality here is really outstanding. As much as I wanted to enjoy the NEC PC 88 conversion by AC Corporation, I just hated the pace of it. I can tolerate frame drops, but with a game that has bullets and enemies all over the place, this was just too much to actually enjoy it. And it's a real shame because the music and sound effects virtually sound identical to the arcade original. Even the layout, which is going for the arcade vertical ratio look, looks really awesome here. But really, the whole frame issue with this was just an absolute killer and just seems to destroy a lot of hard work that likely went into this conversion. I think that if the developer cut back on the number of sprites being on screen all at once, this really could have been such a great version. Now, surprisingly, the MSX 1986 conversion by AC Corporation is a really fun shoot 'em up. Sure, this is an MSX game and it doesn't scroll so well, but the sprites and how quickly they move around on screen really do that justice and certainly make up for it. As you know, because I upload so many arcade port videos in this series, I have become accustomed for MSX generally having that ZX Spectrum style and visuals, but almost being a downgrade in some ways with some MSX games. So this version of 1942 totally surprised me. It plays extremely well and is very responsive with controller. The music and sound effects here are very acceptable too. The Amstrad CPC conversion is actually not that bad at all. It's going for the box gameplay look, just like the Spectrum's version, but this plays much nicer, and it looks like we're truly flying with the scenery below looking much better here. Enemy sprites as well as the player sprites look fairly good here too, with some really nice detail. In terms of perfection with scrolling, it is fairly slightly janky, but sprites work well and that can be forgiven. Sound effects and opening music are really nice here too, a little bit like the Commodore 64's version. Hit collision detection is also spot on here. What I admire with this conversion is that the coder was likely aware that having too much on screen simultaneously would cause frame drops, and so from what I played of this game, it runs really well and it's an overly impressive Amstrad conversion. I haven't played much of the Nintendo Entertainment System's version of 1942 before, but can say it could have been much better for reasons that others also had so far in this video. Firstly, this conversion has frame drop issues, and it does get a tad worse when too much is happening all at once. It's normally a case of sprite flicker with NES games when too much is going on, but this one didn't necessarily just have that. It looks good on playback, but when playing it just didn't seem too wonderful if I'm honest. It released by Capcom in 1986, so a fairly early release for the Nintendo NES. It's not incredibly terrible, it's just that frame issue. The game itself looks good, although Capcom did decide for a full screen for this conversion, rather than the centralized vertical ratio look. The Game Boy Color had its own conversion in 1942, which released by Capcom back in 2001. The nice thing is with this version is having the option to change difficulty levels of the game, as well as enabling or disabling music or sound effects. I chose to have music and sound effects both enabled for this. The sound of the Super Ace as you nosedive sounds really authentic to the arcade game. The pace and speed here is great too, with some very minor frame drops. It's coloured fairly well and collision detection is spot on here too. Enemy planes are nicely detailed. I should imagine back in 2001, original fans of the arcade game would have been over the moon with this Game Boy Color port. Sega Saturn had a version of 1942 on its Capcom Generations disc. If I am honest, and those Saturn fanboys won't like this one bit, it is a little choppy to play admittedly, although this is being extremely nitpicky, as it is absolutely playable without a doubt. We have options to change the aspect ratio to match the arcade look here too, which was a nice little feature. It is coloured really well and everything seems to be in line with the 1984 arcade release. Overly, not a terrible port, but sometimes we do need to get drastic when ranking the last few of over quality conversions. Just like Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation also had Capcom Generations, and this port was on the Wings of Destiny disc. It is very similar to the Sega Saturn's version, only this one, in my opinion, just plays a little more fluid, but it does tend to feel a little bit laggy, and just remember we are talking a tiny, weeny little bit laggy. Not at all does it look or play like the Fujitsu's FM7 conversion. This is a good solid conversion nevertheless, and just like the Saturn's version, it is pretty much like the arcade game, just not as fluid in terms of scrolling. Like I mentioned in the introduction, many collections emerged from Capcom, and here we have in first place the Sony PSP's Capcom Classics Collection Reloaded port. Like Sega Saturn and the PlayStation's version, we have options here too, but a couple of extras added in addition. Screen type and screen size are two options where we can make things look like the arcade version itself, or we can go for a more console-like look. I experienced zero lag here and was extremely fluid and very responsive to play. It looks sharp and shows very little pixelation. Perhaps this was to do with some type of filter that the developers put on this version, who knows. Now just remember the PSP could also be connected to a TV to achieve a full screen, although most would prefer it being portable. The option was there with a video output cable, so a double whammy. And that's it for my ranking the 1942 home conversions today. So as always in this series, which version did you grow up with? Did you have the ZX Spectrum version, or did you end up having more obscure versions such as the FM7 conversion? Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching.